We've decided to let Steve out for the week, so I'm hosting this week in his stead, and he's always a very difficult act to follow, but I will do my best. So, welcome everybody. As I mentioned, I think most of you heard, we've got this wonderful pop concert going on in the back garden here, pretty much. So, I hope that won't intrude too much, but there's not too much I can do about it at the moment. We've got three fantastic presentations this afternoon. Each one's going to be the usual 30 minutes, which will include questions. So if speakers go over, we'll have only a small amount of time for questions. We'll see how we go, but we'll take questions after every paper. I think otherwise you all know the etiquette. We're going to keep muted, and then you'll be asked to unmute yourself if you have a question, and obviously put your hand up virtually in order to do that. That's lovely. So we're going to start off with Ian Bell, who I've just been chatting to, which has been lovely. And Ian, as you may have read on the Eventbrite information, is actually a very seasoned performer. Some of you may know him in the Canadian folk scene, and I know he's worked over here in the UK as well. And he was formerly director of the Port Dover Harbour Museum on the shores of Lake Erie. And so his talk today is going to be about the songs and shanties of the freshwater sailors of the Great Lakes. So over to you, Ian.
Thank you, Julia. Nice to be here and see you. It's a little later in the day for you than it is now. It's only 11 in the morning. I have the whole afternoon to look forward to. And where I am is in Paris, Ontario, which is in darkest southwestern Ontario. And there are actually lots of parts of the United States that are higher in latitude than we are. But that's where I am, and it'll come up on a map. And so I wanted to talk about and sing a few of the songs of the freshwater sailors on the Great Lakes. And I didn't know about this, even though I was raised quite close to the lake, to Lake Erie, in a town called Waterford. But when I was in Toronto and I was working with my longtime musical pal Ann Letterman, and we were back in the traditional music scare of the early 70s, or we were trying to find Canadian traditional music to play. And our friend Barry O'Neill came along one time with an envelope. It was a manila envelope. And in the manila envelope was a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy of a carbon copy of a typescript of the original manuscript of a collection of folk songs that had been collected by a guy named Ivan Walton back in the 1930s. And what he had done at that time was to travel around the Great Lakes to old folks' homes, waterside taverns, sailors' rest homes, and things like that. And he found the last generation of sailors who had worked under canvas on the Great Lakes during the schooner era. And he ended up with a great motherlode of songs and then never did anything with them. So they never got published. And they traveled around in this brown manila envelope form so people like I could find them and start learning them. And they have since been published properly, but I'll talk more about that later. And I'm going to, just to give you an idea of the sort of world we're talking about, I put together a program here, a PowerPoint, and I'll flip back and forth between the PowerPoint and me. And so let's see. Are you seeing that now?
Yes, that's fine. We're seeing that. I just think you need to go into the presentation mode of your PowerPoint.
Yes, and I'm just trying to add because the... Oh, hang on. There we go. Slideshow. Oops. Slideshow. Sorry. When it can't, coming up on Zoom, it looks different than it usually does. They're seeing that now properly?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, good. So this is Port Dover, Ontario. This is where I ended up working in a museum that's just about exactly where that warehouse is behind the little schooners. And this is on the north shore of Lake Erie. And I grew up about 7 or 8 miles inland from this. So this, but it was a place you always went because, gosh, it was a more interesting town than the one I was living in. And as you can see, there are a couple of schooners there. There's some smaller fishing boats and warehouses along the shore. This is the Port Dover Pier, which is still there. Still romances tourists. I was just looking on Facebook, and there was a lovely picture of this pier with a two-masted sailing ship coming in this morning. It was just somebody's extra special private yacht. But these are two really typical Lake Erie 19th century schooners. The one in the front was called the Eliza Allen, and then the black one behind it was the Erie Stewart. And they were about 80, 90 feet long. And in the songs we're singing about, these are the kind of vessels that we're on. There's Port Dover again. That's the Erie Stewart again, and then Port Dover a few years ago, just with a fishing boat coming in, and a tug called the Vac, which lives down there these days. And as you can see, there are some things that don't change all that much. Just if you can't picture exactly what's going on, so Port Dover's here. I'm in Paris, which is up around the top of the D in Dover there. That's where I'm speaking from now. Buffalo, which you may have heard of, is there. There's Toronto. Oswego comes up in one of the songs. This is the St. Lawrence River heading off to Montreal and Quebec City. Here's Chicago. Way up at the tip of Lake Superior is Duluth, where Bob Dylan came from. And he has nothing to do with this story. But these lakes, in the days before the railways came through, this was such an important way to get around. You can see you could cover thousands of miles on these lakes. And those thousands of miles were covered in times like the 1870s, 1880s. There were literally thousands of schooners on these on the lakes. And they were in all the towns. That's Burlington, that's near Hamilton in Ontario. There's Cleveland, Ohio, Green Bay, Wisconsin. And honestly, the docks and the ships, wherever you find them on the lakes, they all look pretty much the same. We're back in Port Dover again. The Eliza Allen and a little sloop called the Viking. And these sailors had their own repertoire of songs. You can see this is a problem that you don't get in the ocean, is that sometimes in the lake you just run out of water. This is the poor old D. Freeman's Run Aground. But there were lots of songs that the sailors sang, and they were a mixture of songs that were imported from the ocean, just straight saltwater shanties and sailor songs, and shanties that had been reworked for the lakes, and sometimes had new lyrics written for them, and songs that were just indigenous to the lakes. And this is one of those. I'm gonna grab my guitar and get back on screen if you want me, and sing this song, which was collected from by Ivan Walton from a fellow named Captain Jeremiah Kavanaugh. And it's a song called "It's Me for the Inland Lakes," and this is one of the ones that I found in that old typescript, and it didn't come with a tune. So I've been singing this for about 40 years, and the tune that occurred to me to sing it to when I first found it was Star of the County Down, because it kind of fit that. And some people sing it to another tune, but I think it's also another one that another singer just fitted to it. But this song talks about how it's easier working on the lakes than on the ocean. The trips are shorter. The food's better because the trips are shorter. You could drink the water, sort of, and the discipline was a lot slacker because the captains knew that if the crew weren't happy, they could quit. I mean, it's a lot easier to hitchhike home from Hamilton than Cape Town. So, and it talks about all those things and the sailors' pay. And you're welcome to sing along, as long as you keep the mute on. If ever I follow the ships again to gather my spuds and cakes, I'll not be working a deep sea hack. It's me for the inland lakes. You get a berth that's really a berth, and the jaw that the skipper takes. No end, I swear it's a wonderful life. It's me for the inland lakes. Well, the runs are short, the vessels are good, and fine men are your mates. They're sharp and they can handle a ship. It's me for the inland lakes. You get a berth that's really a berth, and the jaw that the skipper takes. No end, I swear it's a wonderful life. It's me for the inland lakes. $2 a day, that's the sailor's pay, way better than ocean crates. When the season's done, you go on the bum. It's me for the inland lakes. You get a berth that's really a berth, and the jaw that the skipper takes. No end, I swear it's a wonderful life. It's me for the inland lakes. Late gales may blow, the seas may rise, and the lee is full of country jakes. But the vessels are warm, and the grub is fine. It's me for the inland lakes. You get a berth that's really a berth, and the jaw that the skipper takes. No end, I swear it's a wonderful life. It's me for the inland lakes. No end, I swear it's a wonderful life. It's me for the inland lakes. Thank you. Thank you for moving your hands. I'm going to go back to sharing the screen and talk us. So moving on, another one of the really songs that could exist nowhere else, that doesn't exist on the ocean, is this next one I'm going to sing called Heave Her Up and Buster, which sounds violent, but it's actually about busting the anchor up out of the mud on the bottom of the St. Clair River. And that's where we are in this picture. And this is how they got the schooners through rivers. It would have been bedlam for everybody to be tacking back and forth. And so they were towed by steam tugs while they got the sails ready and got themselves ready to go and sail in the lake. And so this talks about raising the anchor, and it talks about being towed out to Lake Huron. Well, the St. Clair River's 30 miles long. Heave her up, lads, heave her high. We'll set our canvas to this song. Heave her up and bust her. Heave her up and bust her. Heave her up and bust her. We'll set our canvas to this song. Heave her up and bust her. Sailing up the river on a tow-line breeze. Heave her up, lads, heave her high. Astern the flats, ahead big seas. Heave her up and bust her. Heave her up and bust her. Heave her up and bust her. Astern the flats, ahead big seas. Heave her up and bust her. And the tug is belching fire and smoke. Heave her up, lads, heave her high. The line is tight on the towing post. Heave her up and bust her. Heave her up and bust her. Heave her up and bust her. The line is tight on the towing post. Heave her up and bust her. And the wind's wind is blowing from the west. Heave her up, lads, heave her high. Lake Huron seas we soon will test. Heave her up and bust her. Heave her up and bust her. Heave her up and bust her. Lake Huron seas we soon will test. Heave her up and bust her. Thank you. I'm giving you this is a version of a program I do that usually takes a lot longer than this, so I'm doing some slightly truncated versions of things here. Like all these songs, I mean, I realized fairly early on in this that, you know, shanties, shanties aren't really, they're not really songs, they're templates for songs. And so I never feel too bad about leaving bits out or adding bits in. The next song talks about the crews of some of these vessels, and lucky enough to be able to find some studio pictures and other pictures of crews from ships. I love the one on the left where they've gone and posed in the photographer's studio with what looks like a jungle beside them. The one on the right is on the docks at Amherstburg, which is just across the river from Detroit. This is my favorite picture of a crew. I always figured the fellow on the left is the captain, and the boy behind him is his son, you know, be the ship's boy. And I wonder what it was like for that boy to be in the crew with the guy in the front. And I thought there would definitely be an education involved in this. And a song about the Jenny P. King, it was a timber boat, like the sailing boat on the left hand in this picture, and you can see there's timber everywhere. That was a big job, moving cut logs around the river, around the lakes, and down the river to Quebec, and down the Erie Canal to New York City. And this is a song that talks about that. The Jenny P. King was a timber droger, and was also named for a woman, a businesswoman in Buffalo, who the sailors all knew. And apparently the figurehead of the Jenny P. King wasn't a head or a torso or any of the usual things. It was a shapely woman's leg that protruded out under the bowsprit of the boat. I picture that lamp in the movie A Christmas Story. But so this is the song about the Jenny P. King. Come boys, if you will listen, I'll sing to you a song. Sit you down a while and I'll not detain you long. I shipped in Tonawanda some lumber for to bring from Long Point at $1 a day on the bark the Jenny King. Hurrah, me boys, hurrah, come let us dance and sing. We'll drink a health to old Ned Irving and the bark the Jenny King. The crew jumped in the rigging and up aloft did run to see them ride the halyards down. I tell you it was fun. Each man working with a will, and soon we spread our wings. We beat the schooner Dispatch on the bark the Jenny King. Hurrah, me boys, hurrah, come let us dance and sing. We'll drink a health to old Ned Irving and the bark the Jenny King. And on this timber droger we had a curious Canadians too, I think, and Dutch from Tonawanda who like their lager drink, and men from other countries who like to have a fling. You know we had a jolly crew on the bark the Jenny King. Hurrah, me boys, hurrah, come let us dance and sing. We'll drink a health to old Ned Irving and the bark the Jenny King. The lad who tended the horses, he jabbered all the day, and what he tried to tell us, no one could ever say. Our cook was from the Erie, and she was just the thing. She fed the crew and the officers too on the bark the Jenny King. Hurrah, me boys, hurrah, come let us dance and sing. We'll drink a health to old Ned Irving and the bark the Jenny King. Hurrah, me boys, hurrah, come let us dance and sing. We'll drink a health to old Ned Irving and the bark the Jenny King. Thank you. I'm going to find me pictures and just kind of wrap up here. There's the cook was from the Erie and she was just the thing. This is Captain McNelledge, who is a captain. This is an early chart of Lake Erie. The last thing I'm going to play for you, and I'm just going to play you a verse, is Square Jim McDonald. And this is another way some of these songs were preserved. Port Dover, that I talked about, was a fishing town. And this is the way, the black and white picture is the way the fishing basin looked in about 1910. The color picture is the way it looked last summer. And the guy down in the bottom left is Square Jim McDonald, who actually lived in both of those times. Well, not last year, but he lived to see the basin looking more like that. And in a party, he's dead now, but at a party in the 1960s, somebody had a tape recorder and Square Jim started to sing. And he sang a couple of pretty filthy songs, and he sang Danny Boy, and then he sang this.
It's quite quiet, Ian. Is it possible to turn it up?
I don't know. Oh, maybe. Oops, sorry. Well, we don't have time to listen to the rest of Square Jim, but it was such a thrill finding this. Is when I was at the museum. Somebody brought in this tape. I had to go and find a reel-to-reel player to play it on, and what he was singing was a classic shipwreck ballad, and you knew he knew more anyway. So that I skipped past a couple of things that were gonna be at the end. Just we don't have a lot of time, but I know we're supposed to have a bit of question and answer at the end. So I guess it's that time.
Oh, thank you very much indeed, Ian. That was fascinating, actually. Big round of applause from everyone. I can see lots of hands going there. Absolutely, yeah, it was absolutely fascinating. Thank you for leaving a bit of time for questions. It was really lovely to have a sort of a lecture recital there as well from you, as obviously there can't be too many recordings around. So any questions, anyone? Don't see, I see any hands. I see one. Okay, so I think, okay, I see two questions. So Paul Mansfield, we'll start with you, and then Abby Sale next, but starting with Paul. Can you
Thanks.
unmute, Paul?
Can you hear me, Julia? Okay. Yeah, thanks very much, Ian. That was great. I was really interested in the lyrics of the song about the Jenny P. King and the fact that the way it listed the different nationalities of the crew, and it was also evident from the at least one of the photos that there are multiracial crews as well. So I wonder, could you say any more about what's known about the makeup of these crews in that particular way?
It was mostly it was. I mean, and that's true of ocean going ships as well. They were it was a pretty multicultural work environment, certainly more than most people had in the 19th century. On the lakes, it was mostly, it would have been people of European descent, African American, Canadian sailors, and a certain number of indigenous, native people who had fallen into that trade. It was one of those things where if you could do the job, you could have the job. And but there were lots of, and it would depend on where you were, but there were certainly lots of black sailors on the lake, and there are a few songs that really clearly come out of that sort of African American musical tradition as well. And ones that are very specifically about, going up to Lake Superior and loading iron ore and things like that, but from an African American perspective.
That's great, thank you. And I think we've just got time for your question, Abby Sale.
You mentioned body material that the captain knew. I've heard it said by people who specialize in Erie Canal in particular, that there were no bawdy songs, no bawdy Erie Canal songs in tradition. And the only one I've heard was from Richard Dyer Bennett. That wasn't his specialty. Have you come across bawdy canal songs?
No, I actually don't. I don't know. I'm not a real authority on canal songs particularly. Other than having read a couple of books about it. So the answer is no, but that doesn't mean they're not there. It just means I haven't heard them.
They're usually not printed or, in the old days, in the LP days, recorded.
Yeah. I knew Edith Folk, the great Canadian collector, and they wouldn't sing them for her because she was a woman collector, and so she would sometimes, she would have to go out of her way she would occasionally find people who would do it, but it was a problem because it wasn't done.
Thank you.
That's brilliant. Well, thanks again very much, Ian. That's been a fascinating insight. Although I studied in Canada, I've never known much about the inland lake tradition. So thank you again. That's been lovely.
That was fun.
So now we're going to move on to our second speaker, who, if you have been coming to these meetings, will be absolutely no stranger to you. Our very own Martin Graebe, who of course has been the secretary to this group for probably more years than we should actually put a figure to, but in the saying that, has performed great service to us all. And also has dedicated indeed many years of his life to the study of Baring-Gould's manuscripts, culminating in the wonderful book As I Walked Out, published in 2017, which won the Catherine Briggs Folklore Award as well, much deserved. So Martin's going to take us into the whys and wherefores of the Baring-Gould collection, starting with the rough copy manuscript. So over to you, Martin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. Am I on? Yes, I think I'm talking. Right. And may I just say apologies to anyone watching on YouTube. There aren't very many of you, but we did have a problem initially, but everything began to work after about 5 minutes. So, in 1900, Sabin Baring-Gould fulfilled a promise that he'd made more than 20 years earlier, and gave a large volume containing 202 handwritten songs, mostly in several variants, to the Free Library in Plymouth. This was the volume that we now know as his fair copy manuscript. Then on St. Valentine's Day in 1914, he wrote to the librarian William Wright saying, "Dear Mr. Wright, I shall be in Plymouth some day next week and will bring in 14 music books containing the taking down, mostly in pencil, of the folk airs in Devon and Cornwall by the late Reverend H. Fleetwood Shepherd and Dr. Bussell. These were taken down direct from the old singers, and will serve as the best guarantee for the genuineness of the tunes I published. Unhappily, 2 more volumes are missing. One of Mr. Shepherd's was destroyed at his death, and one with the taking down by Dr. Bussell was not very distinct, and I sent it to him in Oxford to ink it in, and he's never returned it." In another letter, Bussell explained that he'd been abroad for an extended period and promised to return the notebook. But only 13 separate volumes were ever received by the library, and the whereabouts of the other 2 remains a mystery. Now, these 13 music books were bound into a single volume, usually referred to as the rough copy. A typescript index was added by the librarians at a later date. The Free Library in Plymouth had been opened in 1876, and Baring-Gould was a strong supporter of the library and a friend of its first librarian, William Wright. The library moved to a new building shared with the museum in 1910. But in April 1941, the building was destroyed by bombs, and some 72,000 books were lost, including the library's entire Devon and Cornwall collection of 15,000 books. Luckily, the fair copy and the rough copy survived. The library was rebuilt, but it's moved to a new site in 2016. The listed front of the former building now has a huge extension called The Box, which houses the museum and the Plymouth Archive, and this is where Baring-Gould's fair copy and rough copy are now kept. Now, I first looked at the rough copy in the late 1970s, and to be honest, I didn't spend a lot of time with it since I had to make the most of my time off work. The fair copy, with the words and tunes together, was then of greater interest. Others had reached the same conclusion, and not many people had then worked with the rough copy, the notable exception being Cyril Tawney, who spent a lot of time working with both manuscripts. Then, in 1989, we discovered the collection of manuscripts and street literature in the part of Baring-Gould's personal library that had been relocated to Killerton House near Exeter. And this gave us a huge amount of new material to work with and led to a search for other surviving material. In 1995, when the Baring-Gould Heritage Project set out to photograph all of Baring-Gould's song manuscripts that were then available, the binding of the rough copy was judged to be in poor condition, and it was decided that it should be conserved and rebound. The books were taken apart and photographed for the microfiche edition before the binder took them away. Now, when the Devon Traditions Project was set up in 2009 to create a digital edition of the manuscripts, it was realised that no one knew where the rough copy was. After an investigation, it was discovered that the work had never been completed by the binder, and that it had been locked away in his drawer for 14 years. The still disbound manuscripts were rephotographed at high resolution, and these are the images that can be viewed on the VWML digital database. The manuscript has now been rebound as 13 separate volumes and is kept in the archive rather than the library. This is the first bit of sharing. Let's see how that goes. Where are we? This diagram shows the main items in the Baring-Gould folk song manuscript collection, the most important of which is the personal copy manuscript containing 2,064 separate items related to more than 670 songs. The 13 volumes of the rough copy manuscript are represented in the bottom left-hand corner here, and there are 4 notebooks, the earliest of which is of particular interest and which I plan to talk about on another occasion. The other 3 notebooks are early attempts at fair copies, subsequently used for other purposes. And then there is the fair copy, now in the Plymouth Library, or rather now in the Plymouth Archive. That was probably started in parallel with the personal copy, but it only contains 202 songs, mostly the ones that Baring-Gould had published. Now, getting ahead of myself. Come back. As I said, the rough copy has received little attention and so remains poorly understood. Rather than a coherent collection of 13 field notebooks, it is, in fact, a set of disparate manuscript notebooks and single sheets pieced together in no particular order. They represent work by Baring-Gould and his co-collectors Frederick Bussell and Henry Fleetwood Shepherd, and the contents are predominantly tunes taken down in the field, though there is additional material such as arrangements of songs by Bussell and Fleetwood Shepherd, and there are also some of the manuscript sheets sent in by informants. The greater part of the notation of songs from the field is that by Bussell, and in a number of cases he's improved the legibility by inking over his penciled notation made in the field. Most of the tunes have a name, but this was not always the name under which Baring-Gould referred to it in other notebooks or in his publications. The titles given to the songs are arbitrary and sometimes a bit jokey. The tunes are sometimes numbered, occasionally dated, and may just possibly identify the singer. The penciled handwriting is hard to read, and the notation is difficult to understand. So, these are the most challenging of Baring-Gould's manuscripts and still contain many secrets within nearly 1,200 items. What is clear is that many of the songs in it were never transferred to any of the fair copies. It's also the case that there is no record in the rough copy for many of the songs in the fair copies. My long-term aim is to identify each of the instances of a song being collected, and then linking that instance to its representation in other manuscripts. And this will help us get closer to an accurate figure for the number of songs that Baring-Gould actually collected. So let's take a dive into the manuscripts and have a look at some of the key features. You may not be able to see all of the fine detail on your screens, but I hope that you will be able to follow what I'm describing. And here you see the case binding of the manuscript as I first saw it when it still contained the 13 separate volumes. If the original covers of the separate notebooks were kept, they didn't survive the bombing of the library. And this is unfortunate because Baring-Gould sometimes refers to other instances, as in, for example, the Blue Book. And now we've got no idea which the blue one actually was. Now, there are two letters pasted onto what would have been the free end paper of the bound book, the one to William Wright, part of which I read earlier, and one from Bussell about his missing volume. Each of the volumes has an index. I'm going to lose this for a moment. That was drawn up by one of the librarians and tipped into the front of the appropriate volume. And though helpful, they do contain a number of misreadings of the handwriting, which, as you will see, is understandable. Looking at the first page of this volume, you'll see a song noted by Bussell during the visit that he and Baring-Gould made to South Seal on the 10th of August 1894. Just make that a bit bigger. There you have, you probably definitely can't read this, South Seal, August the 10th. This is the tune for Jack Robinson, as sung by John Radmore, to a tune similar to College Hornpipe. And here's Baring-Gould's transcription of this in volume 3 of the personal copy. And you can see the tune has been tidied up a bit. Let's go back to volume 1. Just nip out of the enlarge for a moment. Next to the title on several of the songs, you can see, I've gone too quickly again, a mark that is actually, perhaps I'll just enlarge that again for a moment. You can see a mark that looks like a T, but is actually a Roman numeral 1. This is an indication that this is the first of a series of songs collected on this occasion. Here you have number 2 all in a row, and here number 3, which we never have quite figured out what the title actually is. Queen and Country is our best guess of that. So that's a very useful feature when you're trying to work out the sequence of collecting within a visit or within a tour. And the first 5 pages of the book relate to this particular visit to South Seal. And then on page 6, a new sequence starts for a visit to Forgue in Cornwall between the 20th and the 22nd of August 1894, 10 days later. Forgue, which of course would correctly be spelt for F-O-W-E-Y, is given as Forgue, just one of Bussell's little jokes. And the first item is a 3-man song, I Like a Little Wife Well Willed. And that's interesting because it was sung by Henry Symonds and 2 friends, and it's a rare example of the parts of a harmonised song being collected. Below it, item 2, you can see is a first of a sequence of songs by William Houghton, and you can see that Bussell later changed his mind about the order of the phrases as he'd noted them. It's all right, Sean stole my mouse for a moment to let someone in, and you can see that now the new order is 1, 2, 3, 4. Then if we drop on to page 14, have another interesting example of something that puzzled me for some years. This song from collected in Plimpton from William Horn had the title Bunny Avona, It took me some while to work out that that was actually the Irish song Barney Avourneen. In his personal copy, Baring-Gould gave this the title Let Me In, though he did note correctly that it was an Irish song. Going to move on to volume 4. And here you can see an example of, I'll use this to give you an example of how we can use the information in the manuscript to help reconstruct one of Baring-Gould's longer trips on Dartmoor. And here you see the everlasting circle collected from William Nankerville, a stonemason at Merivale Bridge. Let's just pick that up. On the 29th of September 1890. There are 8 songs noted from Nankerville, and then another noted from George Percy, the landlord of the Dartmoor Inn. Have I given myself the right version? Yes, I think I have. If we look now at a map, has that changed? I think it has. You can see that having visited Merivale Bridge, they then went on to Post Bridge, where they stayed the night. In the evening, has that changed to the map?
Yes, Julia says yes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, we can see that. Thanks, Martin. It's the map.
With YouTube running several minutes behind, that's the only way I can see it at the moment. Oh, there we go. Yeah. So they stayed overnight in Postbridge, but in the evening they were staying at the Temperance Inn, so there was not a lot to keep them. They walked over to see Mrs. White, a farmer's wife who lived at Lower Merrypit, a farm nearby, and they heard 2 songs from her. Then the following day they drove over to Scobertor, where they met with another farmer's wife, Anne Roberts, who, despite being a bit unnerved by their visit, gave them 4 songs. They then continued to Chagford, where they met a number of men over supper, including William Agate and John Bennett, from whom they got 6 and 3 songs respectively, and who were so productive that they 2 men went back to meet Baring-Gould and Bussell the following day and gave them another 7 songs. 8 songs, I can't count. The 2 collectors then walked across Dartmoor to Cully Hole, where they met Thomas Gerard and John Stoneman and heard 10 songs from them before walking on to the Warren House Inn, where they stayed the night and where their coachman picked them up the following day. And I believe, though it's not shown in the manuscript, that they actually stopped off again in the Merivale Bridge to pick up a song for someone who hadn't been there 3 days earlier. Now, all that information is not in the rough copy manuscript. Much of it comes from entries in other documents, but it's the rough copy that defines the timeline. Now I'll go back to the manuscripts and show you a couple more things of interest. This is volume 8, and it contains the notation for the visit by Bussell and Baring-Gould to South Brent in September 1888. Probably their first expedition together, and possibly the earliest piece of notation in the whole manuscript. You can also see that at a later stage, Bussell has added his rough working for an arrangement for the song in stylish purple ink. This is one of the songs that was published in the early editions of Songs of the West with Bussell's arrangement, but Cecil Sharp replaced it in the 1905 edition with one of his own arrangements. Volume 13 incorporates some of the individual sheets of tunes sent in by informants, and I wanted to show you this example, which is the tune for Sweet Nightingale, sent to Baring-Gould in 1888 by Edward Stevens, and which Baring-Gould published in the first volume of Songs of the West. And this is the tune the song is most usually sung to nowadays, and it's even been translated back into Cornish. Then volume 14 starts with a selection of more than 180 tunes copied from the first edition of Playford's English Dancing Master. Skipping rapidly through those to page 21. We then come to a number of tunes copied from a tune book lent to Baring-Gould by William Andrew, a fiddler from Sheepstor, and Baring-Gould copied his his tune book out, but he used pages in the notebook, some of which were already occupied. So in between, William Andrews' tunes continue there. But here you've got two particularly interesting song entries. I sowed the seeds of love and the saucy sailors, both collected in Larne in Carmarthenshire by Marianne Mason, who didn't publish those tunes herself, but were in her notebooks. And she probably gave these to Baring-Gould when she visited him. Moving on further through the notebook, page 28, 6, 7, 8, we come to a large set of tunes collected from Robert Hard on the 8th of November 1892. Baring-Gould had heard that Hard was unwell and spent a day at South Brent. He borrowed the vicar's drawing room and piano, and invited Hard to come in, and spent the day and noted 22 songs from him. And Robert Hard actually died 4 weeks later, so that was very timely. That gives you some indication of the material in the rough copy, but I thought I'd just show you the spreadsheet of my work in progress on the manuscripts. Not that one at all. That's better. Again, is that better? That's showing. So, right, here you can see the first few rows of the spreadsheet. It was originally a database, but then Apple stopped supporting the software that I was using, and spreadsheet is a good alternative for now. Here you see the first few rows, part of volume 1. Each tune has an entry number up to 1184, and the basic data for each of the tunes is now in place, and I'm adding the round numbers as I work through the entries. Not unreasonably, Steve will only assign one of these tunes a number if there are words to go with it. Where a tune is linked to an instance in the personal copy or other manuscripts, the row is highlighted in green. Where the tune is not found elsewhere, it's highlighted in pink, and blue indicates that I still have some doubts. Some songs can be found in the other manuscripts in different versions, but not by the singer attributed in the rough copy, so this is a different instance and earns a pink ribbon as a separate instance. The singer is not always given, neither is the date or place always. If you've got a series, you can usually fill that data in. Otherwise, it can often be assumed from context or discovered from another manuscript, particularly if you're able to compare the tune in the rough copy and the tune in the other manuscript, and they look roughly the same. Work on transcription of the tunes has been limited. Sian has transcribed some that were of interest to us, and Gabriela Henriquez has transcribed a large part of volume 1 when she stayed with us. The most important analysis of the rough copy to date, though, has been that by our chair for the afternoon, Julia Bishop. She studied the manuscript when she was preparing the appendix for my book on Baring-Gould. This one, which I'm sure 99% of you will have got, and if you haven't, write to me afterwards and I can find you a nice cheap copy. Julia studied the manuscript with some detail and made some important observations about it, particularly about the difficulties of tracking the versions of songs across the various manuscripts. If I may, I'll quote the part of her conclusion where she said, "As much as he intended the copies to be exactly as taken down, there was also no avoiding the fact that the process involved interpreting handwritten transcriptions produced at speed from a live performance, and in many cases originated by his colleagues rather than himself. It's no wonder then that small anomalies and inconsistencies crop up quite frequently in the personal and fair copy notations. Yet, without those copies, the music of the collection would be considerably harder to access, identify, and understand. And in many instances it simply would not have survived at all. So there is a great deal of work yet to be done on the Baring-Gould manuscripts and lots of opportunities for study of the earliest extant examples of field notation of folk songs. My work on Baring-Gould slowed down for a while after I finished my book, and I've done a few things since. But a recent project looking at songs in Cornwall brought me back to the manuscripts, and I'm still working on my sets of data like the spreadsheet you saw a minute ago. These are continuously evolving and are the key to resolving many of the questions about the structure of Baring-Gould's work. I hope that this will help the musicians better to understand what they're looking at and get to work on resolving many of the musical mysteries. That summarises where I've got to at the moment, and if you have any questions, I'll try and answer them.
Wow, thank you so much, Martin. Big round of applause, everyone. It's completely humbling to think of the amount of work that you've put in since the book as well. I think some people would have just sat back and left it there, but you've gone in deeper into this. It's just really quite astonishing how difficult that work is that you're doing, and we can see from those pictures. So thank you for sharing a little bit of that with us. We just have time. We've got a couple of minutes. I've seen at least one raised hand. I'll have a quick look through. I have Elizabeth. I'm on the wrong view. Okay, so Elizabeth, would you like to go first? Elizabeth Block.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, did Baring-Gould play any instrument? Did he sing? Did he perform those songs himself?
Yeah, he did. He played the piano himself. In fact, he used the piano a lot when he was collecting, if there was one nearby, particularly in the early days. Later on, he got better, and he could at least get some semblance of a tune without reference to piano. But he also sang, and we know from Marianne Mason writing about her visit to him that he would often sing with family and visitors in the evening around the piano, usually with his daughter playing the piano, and he would sing. And we know that his favourite song, and Marianne Mason recommended everybody to hear it, his favourite song was Three Drunken Maidens. So a wonderful song. You might be quite surprised that that was such a favourite.
Thank you. We've just got time. John Baxter, is it a very quick question from you, please?
I just wondered how did he organise all those notebooks? How did he find his way around them? Did he just have an amazing memory? And just briefly, the song Jack Robinson has an interesting history. It was written by Thomas Hudson, I think you know that, and performed by Robert Glinden in the 1820s. Did he know? Well, he often seemed to know stuff like that. How did he organise all those masses of notebooks and cross-reference them? It just seems an amazing thing.
Frankly, it still humbles me to think how smart this man was. He wasn't always right. Some of his mistakes are glaring and with the sort of hindsight we've got, obvious. But you have to remember that at the time there was no internet. How on earth did he manage to compare versions? The answer usually is that he had a memory. I won't say a good memory because he didn't always get it right, but he had a very good memory, and he'd read an awful lot of stuff in the British Library and in his own massive library, where, for example, he had a lot of resources you'd be very envious about what were the songs from the pleasure gardens of the late 18th century. And so he'd just seen this stuff. And I know, as I've gone through, after a while you begin to recognize things. You just know they're there. He just knew so much more. But constantly referring between them, he would add notes. The personal copy is as much a notebook as it is a fair copy. And we know that he was adding stuff to it for nearly 30 years. So just a phenomenal man who was fiendishly clever, bearing in mind that he was also in the process of writing 1,200 other books and magazine articles, and being a vicar.
A difficult act to follow.
And all the rest of it.
Thank you so much, Martin. I'm sorry, we're going to just have to sort of, draw it to a close there, but there's some interesting comments in the chat. Conrad, I'm so sorry I've not managed to fit in your question, but if you would like to pose it in the chat, that would also be fantastic for Martin to pick up on. But, totally fascinating to see the background there to some of your detective work. And I'm sure, it strikes me it's the sort of thing that might need to be crowdsourced, to help you find your way around all of these things. It seems, a lifetime's work. But thank you. So moving on to a third collector I was just going to introduce a couple of films that we've made about James Madison Carpenter. So I'm sure some of you will already be familiar with this and with his work. But as you know, several of us have been working on the Carpenter collection for nigh on 20 years, and there were plenty of people who worked on it before us as well. So I'd like to introduce the films and just a tiny bit about our work, and then, just open it up for discussion really, if anyone has any questions. As you know, I'm interested in folk song. I did my PhD at Memorial University in Newfoundland, and then when I came back to this country and I finished my PhD finally, Ian Russell said to me, well, Julia, there's the Hunt song traditions, and there's this James Madison Carpenter collection, which really needs looking at. And as I was a vegetarian, I decided to go with the Carpenter collection at that time. So that was in the late 90s. As I say, others had looked at it before, and Carpenter was a very important collector in terms of collecting history, if you like, of folk song in Britain, because he kind of fills the gap between the first and the second, sort of major bouts of collecting over here. So fairly recently, as I'm sure you know, we're lucky enough to receive some funding to enable the digitised copies of Carpenter's manuscripts and his sound recordings to join what was then called the full English, and it became far less English because a lot of Carpenter stuff comes from Scotland. And as part of that grant, we made a couple of films about the collection to introduce Carpenter. So this is why I'm not introducing him, because I'd like to now get Martin to play the first film. It's extremely short, just to give you a sense of who Carpenter was and what his collection consists of. And then I'll talk a little bit more.
In 1929, a former schoolteacher from Mississippi arrived in Britain to collect folk songs. James Madison Carpenter had recently gained his PhD from Harvard for his thesis on folksole songs and shanties. On arrival, Carpenter bought a car and struck off northwards up the east coast.
I just set out on my own. I'd already had the summer before collecting the shanties. I went up that east coast there and worked every town. I was foolish enough to get a little open Austin car. And as I went north, farther north, I got the heavier and heavier suits, and finally when I got to Aberdeen, I said, give me the thickest, warmest woolen suit of underwear you have. And it was like a coat, but I wore it.
He not only found sea shanties, but folk songs of many kinds. They included traditional ballads, which some scholars and collectors consider to be of particular literary value. As well as songs, Carpenter gathered many mummers' plays, and a selection of fiddle tunes, customs, children's games and folk tales. Such was his success that his one-year trip turned into a 6-year one and involved 40,000 miles of travelling. Carpenter's method of collecting usually involved the use of both a portable typewriter and a dictaphone cylinder machine.
Back in 29, the dictaphone was brand new. Nobody had ever heard of it, and the idea of having anything that would record a voice was a wonderful thing to them. So they were excited about the dictaphone, a machine that could record their own voice.
He later copied the cylinder recordings onto discs and transcribed the music of many of the songs. He also retyped the words that he'd taken down from the singer's dictation. Despite all this work on his collection, Carpenter never managed to get it published. Towards the end of his life in 1972, he sold it to the Library of Congress, where it was preserved and digitized. Carpenter's collection is not only large and diverse, it is also significant for a number of reasons. It provides some of the only evidence we have of folk song from the period between the First and Second World Wars, and bridges the gap between the two main periods of English and Scottish folk song collecting. Despite the limitations of his recordings, it's possible for us today to pick out the distant-sounding voices of his contributors and to appreciate their artistry. In total, some 800 people are represented in the collection. Their contributions testify to the richness of the traditional performing arts in families and communities and within certain occupations. Their details are also of interest to family and local historians. Thanks to James Madison Carpenter, they've been preserved for posterity.
Thank you, Martin. So I'd like to acknowledge the help of Z. Allison at the University of Aberdeen, who actually did the voiceover for that, and she was also in their film unit and helped us to draw, as you heard, on some of the assets from the collection to give you a sense of it and introduce it. So there's lots of connections between Carpenter's work and our previous two talks. As you heard, he never published this incredible collection, and we were very lucky that Alan Jabbour, the late Alan Jabbour, who was the director of the American Folklife Centre at the Library of Congress, was able to track Carpenter down in the 1970s. He interviewed him, and you heard a clip from the interview in the film there, and acquired the collection to the Library of Congress in 1972. And as I mentioned, quite a few people have worked on it. It contains ballads, it contains shanties, it contains fiddle tunes, folk plays, children's games, carols, all kinds of material. And in the sort of, I think it was sort of the early 2000s, as I said, I became very interested in it. I was also able to visit the Library of Congress, which was a real boon and work actually on the collection itself. And they were working on digitising it, which was immensely helpful. And a team of us, some of whom are here today, so I would like to say, call on, there's Elaine Bradkey was part of our team, Bob Walser, part of our team, David Atkinson, Tom McCain, and the late Eddie Cass. And I assembled these guys, some of whom I didn't really know very well before, because they had specialisms in the genres which were featured in the Carpenter collection. And we put in for some funding, and we got a letter back from the funders saying, oh no, we're not going to fund you, you've no control over this material, you need to catalogue it first. And actually, it was a real disappointment not to get the funding, but it was completely correct. And it sort of was illustrated very much by Martin's talk there, that you need to get some kind of control over all these different versions, because just as with the Baring-Gould collection, we can't really tell you exactly how many things Carpenter collected, because there's lots of different drafts and versions and recordings and written transcriptions. And to get a final number on all these things is a big job. So we settled down, we produced the online catalogue, which is at the University of Sheffield, but unfortunately we're unable to feature the actual recordings and the actual digitised images as part of that, and I know some of you still use that resource. So much later on we were lucky enough to get extra funding more recently in order for that to be incorporated, those to be incorporated into the full English, as it was then, of the Vaughan Williams Library. So it's now available. I'm sure some of you have used it. So meanwhile, the rest of us sort of thought, we're not going to stop here, we're going to go back to our critical edition idea, because we wanted to publish it and make it available to you all. So we got down to work on it. We've been editing it. We had a really good go at editing it, and we almost got to our goal, but there are literally, I mean, there are over 6,000 songs probably in there alone in all these different versions. And we hadn't quite finished the job, so we're just about to reassemble and to work on that a bit more. We're hoping to get it to its final fruition. In the meantime, we're looking at maybe building up our index or our catalogue again at Sheffield to feature the digitised things, the digitised images and recordings, so that this can form a kind of digital complement to the published collection, because we really still would like to publish it as a book. Okay, so we're still thinking that it's something you can hold in your hand, which you can turn the pages of, but also you can do some comparative work. You can actually hear some of the tunes that we've transcribed and we've worked on. You can actually do some, then you can go off and look at the round numbers. That was something Baring-Gould never had access to. I thought, Martin, when you mentioned that, we're lucky enough to have all that at our fingertips now to produce something that's of comparative value for scholarship on the one hand, but also is important for performance as well. As well as the editing work that we've done on the collection, we've also done a bit of research on some of the contributors, and we've had the pleasure over the years of when the online catalogue went up, we've had people contact us because they've been doing their family tree and they discovered that their ancestor's name was actually in the collection. And I can tell you there's nothing more pleasurable than to tell somebody we've actually made an effort to trace some too, and there's nothing more pleasurable to say to somebody, actually, I've got your grandfather's voice and it's in the Library of Congress, and here it is. Those families and those descendants have also shared a great deal of information with us, which has helped us to sort of humanise really far more the people who contributed to the collection and find out much more about their lives, about their biographies, about how they came to meet Carpenter, and other cultural activities in which they were involved. So the second film that I'd like to share with you now is just a tribute to one of those families. We'd really, as you've heard, there are hundreds of contributors to the collection, about 800 we think, and it hasn't been possible to make a film for all of them, but one of the significant families from Aberdeenshire was the Campbell family. And in the interview, Carpenter talks about meeting Alexander Campbell and how Sandy Campbell introduced him to one of his major
top. Jesse Ann Weir and Alec Campbell. And they had a son and 3 daughters, namely my father, Alexander Hector Campbell, and Jeannie, Mary, and Madge. Well, my grandfather was Alexander Campbell as well, known as Sandy, and Carpenter went to him first of all at Hassiewells and subsequently to Bulgaveney House, and collected that and a lot of other songs, but collected all the stuff that he wrote in his book. I obviously was not in the go when Carpenter was there, so I didn't know much about him, but apparently he stayed a long time with my grandfather and collected a lot of stuff, presumably from other sources as well. He was sent to school at the age of 7 and left to enter farm service at the age of 12. And speaking of this, Stanley would laughingly remark, "Gin I didna get lang at squeal, I got a neuch in the higher house." Well, obviously, Mackintosh of Wembley was the man who published the book, but how they came to reach that stage, I'm not really aware of. But Mackintosh published The Heather Bells of Benahee. This is a poem from my grandfather, and it's headed The Ordnance Survey for Southampton. There were 5 jolly fellows came to Benahee to tuck up the levels tween it and the sea. As merry a quorum as e'er I met we did that Ordnance Survey for Southampton. But nor a wa and may I gwid ging with them. It's nae very likely that I'll ever see them, but if they come back, my assistance I'll give them, yon Ordnance Survey for Southampton.
All Benahee has magic powers in summer heat and thunder showers. Continually the traffic pours to see this famous mountain. They come on fit, they come on capes, they come they are the blessed apes. There's something that trepans their hearts to climb this famous mountain.
Jeannie was at home at the time, so she would have been party to all of what went on really. While the other ones were away from home during that time, we had been home at times, but my Aunt Jean was always at home.
Well, and your father was the only one that married.
My father was the only one that married, exactly.
Yes.
And of course he chose a wife for London. My Aunt Mary, who was a nurse in Woolwich, had lived in a flat owned by my mother. And she took my mother up on holiday to Bulgaveney and met my father, and well, the rest is history. Whose first love was joinery, I suppose. Although we had a wee croft and a tractor, which he couldn't drive. So as a bairn I had to do the driving and the tractor for him. But he worked as a joiner first with Mackintosh of Wembley, who actually was published the Heather Bells of Benahee. He worked with Mackintosh of Wembley, and then latterly he worked on his own at Bulgaveney. He did a lot of concerts and things like that, and therefore he was in kind of demand really for doing these things. He didn't write any poetry, but he collected a lot of stuff. And I think his favourite was Burns, of course, because I was waking at night during Burns' time, him reciting Burns all night almost.
You could just actually do the first line of any bit of Burns and he would finish it. He knew it that well.
Just pick up a book.
Pick up a book, take a page, read the first line, and he would just carry on.
When first I left Aberdeen to Liverpool, I went. It was to push my fortune there, it was my whole intent. And when I land in English ground, it's up to fellas game. Said, Scotty, for ye the day, and who's your friends at home? Kind gentlemen, I answered them, as soon as e'er they spoke. My mither and the pigs are fine, that's all the friends I've got.
He must have thought it was time to put all his recitations and his songs onto tape. So we decided to get him a tape recorder. At this time he was unwell actually, and I think was behind his thinking for us and for the family to put all his recitations and songs on tape. And so we got him a tape recorder, and needless to say, he spent hours in bed reciting and singing. We didn't know that we weren't going to have him for that much longer, but he obviously had thought about this seriously, and he was getting out of breath while he was doing it, but he did it, and thankfully we have got, that's quite precious to us.
Fair in Tara Square, and I was there for sale. The way I spent the long day was drinking beer and ale. As I get up and further up the market taking room, smoking out an old clay pipe for a first where I was bound. I met a chill so likes myself with heavy kind of swing. Says Geordie man to Bugs, I'm gone the Fosker for to hang. All Bugs he needs a second man, you'd shoot the job right well. Fune come home with me to Bugs the second pair to reel.
Thank you very much, Martin. That's fine. So I hope, well, I'd just like to, sort of acknowledge publicly, how privileged we were, obviously, to have access to the Campbell families. They had so many old photographs, which they shared with us, and those cassette recordings, which are now digitised and at the in the archive of the Elphinstone Institute at the University of Aberdeen. And I'd just like to sort of finish by pointing out what a very different view we might get of the family from talking to the descendants than we just do through the lens of the Carpenter collection. So through the Carpenter collection, they look one way, but here we had all kinds of other information about their cultural activities, about Sandy Campbell's poetry, and also Hector Candle's performance career and his extensive song collection as well, and recitations. So, it's something I think we're very lucky to, because Carpenter is that little bit nearer to us in time, we're able to do that, although that time is now receding. And it's going to be harder and harder to get hold of those descendants. Anyway, that was sort of really what I wanted to say, and we just probably have 2 or 3 moments for questions. And as Elaine and Bob, I know for definite they're here. I'm not sure if anyone else from the team is here, but I'm just open up the floor for any questions that we have. Do chip in, Elaine and Bob, if you'd like to. If there's anything important you think I've missed out. I did see a quick question in the chat about funding for Carpenter. He was very unusual. He had funding from Harvard, one of our few funded folk song collectors, I think. He had a Sheldon Fellowship from Harvard. He was also unusual in being academically trained at the time. Then he later ran out of money. Kittredge, as you saw, Kittredge was one of his mentors. He got a bit more money from Kittredge because he thought he was such a good field worker. And then he published some articles in the New York Times, I think, to fund the rest of his activities. So that's it. I'm going to finish there, but I hope you enjoy the films and they brought it alive a little bit for you. Thank you. The quiet hands. Thank you very much, everyone. Any questions? Let's have a look through. We have time. Conrad, I think I see your hand up.
Yes, hands up. I also remember that everybody contributed on both sides, and so you're all wonderful people for making this all work. And when I saw it in the boxes at LLC, it's just such a big pile of stuff. But the other thing about Carpenter is to remember that he also cited books, all kinds of sources, cutouts, and things that he found. So there's a wide variety of source material that he put into his collection. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing just to sit and read the material, even if you're not looking for something. It always gave me a good excuse to get downtown in Washington and run down to Kelly's Irish Times by Union Station.
Thank you, Conrad. Yeah, and I was also, I should mention that I was lucky enough to get funding to go and visit Carpenter's niece, who had kept a lot of his things. So in fact, I have some of those materials here at my house, and eventually they'll be given to the Library of Congress. So we're hoping to do some autobiographical, biographical work on Carpenter himself. Mike, Mike, I just see you have, is it a quick question? And then I think we better finish with a quick advert for next time. So go ahead.
It's very quick. I mean, I went into the collection looking at stuff up in Teesdale, Richmond, North Yorkshire, and I can't find a date of when Carpenter was actually in that area. Has anyone sort of defined that?
It was absolutely hopeless on dates, Carpenter. What I did find when I went to his, when I found a lot of his personal effects, was that he also had, never really sorted it through. And so there were sort of like things like laundry bills from different parts of the country and, the receipt for the car and this and that and the other there. So it is my intention to go through that material. Occasionally we know from the letters that he wrote. So although we can't quite do what Martin did with a map, it would be really good to plot what we do know. Occasionally there are dates. And I would need to have a look. But if you do need to know, do get in touch and we'll see what we can find. As to the dates he was in that particular part of the world, but there isn't a consistent dating of his manuscripts, I'm sorry to say.
Julia, Brian Peters actually had his hand up first, and
I'm so sorry, Brian. Do you think we've got time? Yeah, go on. Go ahead.
Yeah, 3 great talks today, and the last one was wonderful, particularly the detail on the Campbell family. I'm just interested, although Carpenter obviously collected a wide range of different kinds of folk performance, but just relating to his songs, did he share the same kind of filters that the Edwardian collectors like Sharp and so on did regarding later material like Music Hall and so on?
Yeah, it's probably, David, I know you're here as well. It's quite a difficult question to answer because I don't think we can quite see him. He's not in that lineage exactly the same way. He wouldn't have recorded, I don't think, any music hall songs, no. But I think he was a horse out of a different stable because he'd had that lineage from Harvard. Kittredge was a student of Child, he was, and before that, of course, he was interested in shanties. But also some of Carpenter, he was a bit of a naive, he was a library scholar until he arrived in this country and suddenly thought, I better, he was going to collect. So sometimes, sort of some slightly more unusual things perhaps turn up, but no, he wouldn't. I don't think he would have. I can't think of any examples of anything popular that he would have. And he was very much into ballads. So he certainly had biases, definitely, in the collection. But I think there might have been for slightly different reasons because he wasn't a horse out of the folk song scholars, composers, English composers kind of stable. And, so he was coming at it from a different thing.
Okay, thanks. And also, thanks for the collection, which I've used quite a lot in my own research. I think it's a great resource.
Well, we're working on giving you the full Monty eventually. So.
Yeah, I'll have the review copy of the book. That'd be great.
Thank you all ever so much. You've been a wonderful audience today. Just before we go, though, I just need to say that I believe that everybody on the Traditional Song Forum is going to get a bit of a rest in August, and there will be no sessions until the 5th of September, when the next one, I think we're rejoining then. We've got a talk from David Atkinson, Margaret Bennett and Ronan Driscoll then. Meanwhile, if you have any questions, further questions for any of us speakers today, I think the talks are fitted together really beautifully, actually, the different, piece together the different approaches of these collectors and the many commonalities between them. But otherwise, I think it just remains for me to say thank you to Martin as well for his work in the background there. And I hope you all have a fantastic summer, and we will see you again in the autumn.